There is something important you must understand about anger in these situations. When a narcissistic woman succeeds in making you angry, the emotion you feel may seem justified, but from a psychological perspective, it often means the interaction has already moved onto her terrain. Anger feels powerful in the moment. It gives the impression that you are defending yourself, standing up for truth, or pushing back against unfair treatment. But in many manipulative dynamics, that reaction is precisely what the other person is waiting for. The narcissistic personality thrives on emotional reactions. Attention, outrage, frustration. These are all forms of psychological energy. When you react with visible anger, your focus shifts away from clarity and toward impulse. Your voice rises, your thinking becomes less precise, and the conversation becomes chaotic. In that moment, control subtly changes hands. Psychologically speaking, the goal is rarely the argument itself. The goal is the emotional reaction. Once anger appears, the situation can easily be reframed. Suddenly, the discussion is no longer about what was said or done. Instead, the focus becomes your reaction to it. The narrative quietly shifts. You become the aggressive one, the unreasonable one, the person who overreacted. And the original issue disappears behind the smoke of emotion. This is why many people walk away from these interactions feeling confused. They entered the conversation believing they were defending themselves, yet somehow they leave appearing like the villain of the story. That confusion is not accidental. It is the result of emotional manipulation working exactly as intended. The deeper lesson here is not about suppressing anger, but about understanding its strategic consequences. The moment anger becomes visible, you are no longer operating from clarity. You are operating from reaction. And reaction is the easiest thing in the world to control. So before you raise your voice, before you react, pause and ask yourself a simple question. Whose game are you about to play? Because the moment you understand that anger can be used against you, is the moment you begin to take your power back. If you look closely at these dynamics, you will begin to notice that anger rarely appears out of nowhere. It is usually the result of carefully constructed emotional pressure. A narcissistic personality often relies on subtle psychological traps, small, repeated actions that slowly push another person toward frustration. These traps are rarely obvious at first. In fact, they often appear harmless, even accidental. But over time, their pattern becomes clear. One of the most common traps is blame. No matter what happens, responsibility quietly shifts onto you. If something goes wrong, it becomes your fault. If you try to explain yourself, your explanation is dismissed or twisted. And if you point out the unfairness of the situation, the conversation suddenly becomes about your tone rather than the issue itself. In this way, the focus is constantly redirected away from the original behavior. Another powerful tool is guilt. You may hear statements that subtly question your character, suggestions that you are selfish, insensitive, or uncaring. These accusations are not always loud or dramatic. Often they are delivered calmly, almost casually, which makes them even more destabilizing. Over time, you begin to defend yourself more and more, trying to prove that you are not the person being described. And in doing so, you become emotionally invested in the very game that was designed to exhaust you. Then there is the silent treatment, which operates on a deeper psychological level. Silence creates uncertainty. It leaves the other person guessing, analyzing, and searching for what they did wrong. Human beings are wired to seek resolution in relationships, so this silence creates an internal tension that grows stronger the longer it lasts. Eventually, many people break that silence themselves, often apologizing simply to restore peace. Even when they have done nothing wrong, these tactics share a single purpose: to destabilize your emotional balance. When confusion, guilt, and frustration accumulate, anger becomes almost inevitable. And once anger appears, the dynamic shifts exactly where the manipulator wants it. Recognizing these emotional traps is the first step towards stepping out of them. Because once you see the pattern clearly, you no longer react automatically. You choose your response. And the moment you begin choosing your response, the trap begins to lose its power. At a certain point in these interactions, something very subtle but very important happens. The moment you lose control of your emotions, particularly your anger, the entire dynamic changes. What began as a disagreement or a legitimate concern suddenly transforms into a scene where your reaction becomes the main focus. And in that moment, power quietly slips away from you. Think about how easily this shift can occur. You may have been patient for a long time. You may have tolerated repeated provocations, subtle insults, or constant blame. Eventually, the pressure builds, and like anyone under sustained tension, you react. Your voice becomes sharper. Your words become more direct. Perhaps you raise your tone, or express the frustration you have been holding back for weeks or even months. But here is the psychological twist. The moment that reaction appears, the story changes. Now the attention is no longer on the behavior that provoked you. Instead, the spotlight moves to your anger. The conversation becomes about how you spoke, how loudly you spoke, or how aggressive you appeared. The original issue fades into the background, replaced by a new narrative in which you are portrayed as unstable or unreasonable. From a psychological perspective, this is an extraordinarily effective strategy. Human beings tend to judge situations based on what they see in the present moment, not the long chain of events that led there. So when others witness your anger, they may not see the months of provocation behind it. They only see the explosion. This is why so many people find themselves feeling misunderstood after these conflicts. They know what pushed them to that point, yet the world around them seems to focus only on the reaction itself. And that reaction becomes the evidence used against them. Understanding this dynamic changes everything. It reveals that emotional control is not weakness. It is strategic clarity. The person who remains composed keeps control of the narrative, while the person who explodes often loses it. So the next time you feel anger rising, pause for a moment and remember this: the instant you lose control, the story stops being about what happened to you and starts being about how you reacted. And that is a trade you should think very carefully before making. At this stage, many people believe the solution is to argue harder, explain themselves more clearly, or prove their point with greater intensity. It feels logical. After all, if someone is distorting the truth or provoking conflict, the natural instinct is to confront it directly. But in certain psychological dynamics, especially those involving narcissistic behavior, confrontation fueled by emotion often feeds the very cycle you are trying to escape. Real strength in these situations does not come from louder arguments. It comes from emotional detachment. Now, detachment does not mean indifference, nor does it mean you stop caring about truth or fairness. What it means is that you step back from the emotional storm and begin observing the situation with clarity rather than reacting from impulse. When you detach emotionally, something interesting happens. You start seeing patterns that were invisible before. The repeated provocations, the subtle attempts to redirect blame, the predictable moments when tension is created just to trigger a reaction. Instead of being caught inside the drama, you begin watching the drama unfold. This shift is profoundly powerful. The person who is trying to provoke anger relies on your emotional participation. The moment you stop reacting in the expected way, the dynamic begins to lose its structure. The arguments become less satisfying for them because the emotional reward they seek, your frustration, your outrage, your attempts to prove yourself, no longer appears. Psychologically, this is similar to removing fuel from a fire. Without emotional fuel, the conflict struggles to sustain itself. And while the other person may attempt to escalate their tactics for a while, over time the absence of reaction weakens the pattern. Emotional detachment also restores something that anger takes away: your ability to think clearly. When you are calm, you choose your words carefully. You decide when to speak and when silence serves you better. You act from intention rather than impulse. And perhaps most importantly, detachment protects your inner stability. It reminds you that another person's behavior does not have to dictate your emotional state. Because the real victory in these situations is not winning the argument. The real victory is refusing to surrender control of your mind.
Once you begin to understand the power of emotional detachment, another insight naturally follows. Not every situation requires a response, and not every accusation deserves a defense. In fact, one of the most underestimated forms of psychological strength is the ability to remain silent when someone is trying to pull you into unnecessary conflict. Many people believe silence means weakness. They assume that if they do not argue back, they are somehow surrendering the truth. But in certain manipulative dynamics, arguing is exactly what keeps the cycle alive. Each explanation you offer becomes another opportunity for the conversation to be twisted, redirected, or escalated. Consider what often happens during prolonged arguments. You explain your perspective, and it is dismissed. You clarify your intention, and it is questioned. You defend yourself, and suddenly your defense becomes evidence that you are being defensive. The discussion moves in circles, growing more emotional and less rational with each exchange. Hours can pass, yet nothing is resolved. Silence interrupts that pattern. When you choose not to engage in endless explanations, you remove the stage on which the drama performs. The energy that once fueled the argument simply has nowhere to go. This does not mean you never speak your truth. It means you become deliberate about when your words will actually serve a purpose. Silence also communicates something powerful without saying a single word. It shows that you are not desperate to win approval, and you are not compelled to justify yourself at every challenge. That quiet confidence can be deeply unsettling to someone who relies on emotional reactions to maintain control. Over time, this calm restraint shifts the dynamic. The manipulative rhythm of provocation and reaction begins to break down. Without the expected response, the pattern becomes difficult to sustain. Of course, practicing this kind of silence is not easy. Human beings naturally want to correct misunderstandings and defend their character. But wisdom lies in recognizing when a conversation is truly about understanding, and when it is simply about control. And sometimes the most powerful statement you can make is the one you never speak, because the moment you stop arguing with chaos is the moment chaos loses its hold on you. After understanding all of this, the emotional traps, the manipulation of anger, the shift in power that occurs when you lose control, and the quiet strength of detachment and silence, there comes a moment when knowledge alone is no longer enough. Insight must eventually lead to a decision, and that decision belongs entirely to you. Many people spend years trying to manage these dynamics without ever stepping back to ask a deeper question. What kind of life do I actually want to live? When you are constantly navigating provocation, defending your intentions, or recovering from emotional exhaustion, something important slowly erodes. Your mental clarity weakens, your peace disappears, and your attention becomes consumed by problems that seem to repeat themselves again and again. Psychologically speaking, patterns like this rarely change unless something in the system changes, and the one element you truly control is your own participation in that system. You cannot force another person to develop self-awareness. You cannot compel them to take responsibility for their behavior. But you can decide how much access they have to your time, your emotions, and your inner stability. This is where personal boundaries enter the picture. Boundaries are not punishments. They are not acts of revenge. They are simply clear decisions about what you will and will not allow to dominate your life. Sometimes those boundaries involve limiting conversations that lead nowhere. Sometimes they involve refusing to participate in predictable cycles of conflict. And in certain situations, they may require creating distance altogether. Making that decision can feel difficult because human beings naturally hope that understanding will lead to change. But wisdom also involves recognizing when a pattern has revealed itself clearly enough. The deeper question is no longer whether someone else will change. The real question is whether you will continue surrendering your peace to a dynamic that has already shown you its nature. In the end, the most important power you possess is the power of choice. You can continue reacting to the same pattern, or you can step outside of it entirely. And sometimes the moment you decide to protect your peace is the exact moment your life begins to change.